There is a U.S. financial expert known as Barron's, I guess. I don't really follow financial news or things like that, but whenever something gets in the news about Nintendo, I tend to sit up and pay attention. And Barron's had posted an article basically saying that Apple should buy Nintendo, and of course, like a bunch of people were like, "Is Apple buying Nintendo?" Especially because right after that, Nintendo's shares went up 5%, which, I mean, maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not a coincidence, but it begs an interesting question, and it's a question that it's certainly not the first time that somebody has said that Apple should buy Nintendo. I think that if you were to compare the two companies, um, Apple and Nintendo would be a pretty fair comparison. They tend to do their own thing. Uh, they always tend to stay outside the pack. They like to design their own hardware rather than developing software for other hardware. Their fans tend to be pretty intense. Not obviously all of them, but many of them. Um, I am a fan of both companies. I have Apple stuff, I have Nintendo stuff, and I think that it would definitely be a good move for Apple. Now, Apple has like 150 billion dollars of cash on hand, just sitting there doing nothing, just sitting there collecting interest. And I guess right now, Nintendo is currently valued. Again, I'm not a business guy, I'm not a financial guy. I don't really know about this stuff, but Nintendo is currently valued at like 40 billion. So Apple could essentially just pay cash for Nintendo if they wanted to. They could walk up and say, "Here's the money in a big old case. There's your cash." The all the shareholders of Nintendo would make a big old wad of cash, and then Apple could walk away being the owners of Nintendo. And you know, I tried to think about this today, in what little time I had, but I was too swamped and I didn't really get a chance to form any thoughts about it. So anything that I say right now is all just right off the top of my head, and that shouldn't be any big surprise to you guys. That's usually how I run the show. So let's think about who would benefit from an Apple Nintendo merger. Well, I think Apple would benefit big time. Nintendo has a lot of really, really strong intellectual property that Apple could then leverage. Imagine if the next Mario or the next Zelda mobile games were exclusive to iOS. That would tick off a lot of Android people. Um, but would it be enough to drive people to Apple? I don't think so. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think people choose the operating system of their phone separately from what apps are available on it. But that being said, most apps are available on both phones or both operating systems. So I don't really know what to think about whether or not it's something like I don't really know what to think about whether or not Apple would then restrict Nintendo mobile products to Apple devices. Um, I think people who own an Apple TV would probably benefit. Like I'm sure that Nintendo would start putting out stuff for the Apple TV, especially something that they could do. And I don't really know how powerful an Apple TV is. I doubt it's as powerful as a Nintendo Switch, but I could be wrong. I could see Nintendo selling and I've said this in the past. I could see Nintendo selling a Nintendo controller that would be required for playing games on the Apple TV, and then you would be able to download the latest new Super Mario Brothers U Deluxe Apple TV edition onto your Apple TV and play it there. So that's an interesting thing. It's really funny that this article comes out shortly after Mr. Furukawa kind of said something in passing about whether or not Nintendo was going to stick in the home console market. And, I've talked about this before, so you can go back and check out previous episodes to get my thoughts on that. TLDR, I'm pretty sure Nintendo's going to keep making hardware. But what if Apple did buy Nintendo? Do we think that Nintendo would continue making their own hardware? I mean, you look at the Nintendo Switch, and while it's it's a good piece of hardware, I'm very impressed with what Nintendo did. It certainly isn't elegant. You look at what Apple does, and Apple's all about the elegance. They're all about seamless lines. They don't like to have ports. You would probably have the headphone jack would disappear from the next version of the Nintendo Switch. Maybe there'd be a notch. I don't know. There's a whole bunch of questions that have to be asked, and the reason I'm talking about it is just because I think that it's interesting, not because I think it's going to happen. It's not like there's a rumor that it's happening. It's really just this business publication said, what'd be cool is if Apple bought Nintendo. And they aren't coming at it from a video game perspective. Those financial magazines are coming at it from the perspective of, look how similar these two companies are. Their corporate structure would probably work really, really well together. And that would benefit a merger between the two, because there wouldn't be people, like, the ball wouldn't be dropped. Basically, there would probably be a pretty damn good transition if that were to happen. But this guy probably isn't thinking, would Apple be hands off? And whenever I think about Apple, they are control freaks. If I were to say one thing about Apple, is that they are control freaks. They want you to do things the way that they want you to do them. Of course, you say the same thing about Nintendo. Nintendo are kind of control freaks as well. They really want you to do things the way that they want you to do them. So it is kind of a match made in heaven, but at the end of the day, I think it would be bad for the video game industry. It would be bad for fans of Nintendo intellectual property, people who like Zelda or Animal Crossing or Mario, like all that stuff. And it would be bad for people who like the innovation that Nintendo tends to do around hardware, because I think that at the end of the day, Apple, they would want everything to go through your iPhone or your iPad. They would want the stuff to go through your iPhone or your iPad. And if you do that, unless there's physical hardware involved with the buttons, I'm not interested. I want physical hardware buttons to play games with. And it's not a very elegant solution for how you slap some controls on the side of these. Sure, you could make a thing that holds your device and has buttons on either side. And while even I've proposed that in the past before the Switch came out, I don't think that that's the right way to go for Nintendo or for Nintendo's intellectual property. It would be very good for Nintendo, though. It would make them, like, if they moved to really focus a lot more on their mobile platforms. Like, we've got Mario Kart Tour coming out. We've got Animal Crossing, Pocket Camp. We've got Fire Emblem Heroes, Super Mario Run, and something else that I can't think of. Like, those games are making a lot of money for Nintendo, and it would make Nintendo a whole bunch of money. Actually, it would make Apple a whole bunch of money to have Nintendo kind of focus on that stuff instead of focusing on things like our awesome Nintendo Switch back here. So while I am totally against this, and I also don't think that this is going to happen, I think that it would be beneficial for both Apple and Nintendo to do this, and it would be very detrimental to people who love video games, the video game industry as a whole, and I think it would just be a really, really bad idea, and I hope that it never happens. And this is coming from somebody who is a huge fan of Apple and a huge fan of Nintendo. And while I think that they would make really good partners, I think that at the end of the day, it would be bad for almost everybody who doesn't just have a financial stake in it. So fingers crossed that it doesn't happen.